All right, so this is the Gettysburg Address. And don't forget to check out the extra videos that I post at the bottom. I will be posting some extras of the information about Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. All right. So the Civil War is the battle between the North and the South over slavery, which some people argue it's really over money and power. Because at that point, they were making more money in the South, and they were taking the votes from their slaves to impact how the elections went. It's very fascinating to learn about this. I have done a lot of reading about the past, and again, Abraham Lincoln wanted to make sure that slavery did not tear apart the United States. And so that's why it was very important to him to make a stand through, about slavery to abolish it. So here we go. The Union marched more than 93,000 soldiers into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the Confederates more than 71,000. When the fighting stopped 3 days later, nearly 51,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. For every 10 soldiers who fought in the battle, 3 were hurt or killed. The Battle of Gettysburg ended Lee's northward advance. However, the battle brought devastation to both sides as well as the town. I'm going to use this as one of my facts. Public buildings and even private homes had to be used as hospitals for the wounded. Every farm was a graveyard. Although the war continued for another year and a half, no other Civil War battle killed more men than the Battle of Gettysburg. So I bet this next part with the subheading, the Gettysburg Address, is going to tell us why it's so important. I guess the fact that more people died there than any other place is going to have a huge part to do with it. It says the field at Gettysburg became the first national cemetery. 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, on November 19, 1863, the Soldiers' National Cemetery was ready to be dedicated. President Lincoln was invited to give a few of the appropriate remarks, but he wasn't the main speaker. Instead, one of the most popular speakers of the time, Edward Everett, gave the formal speech, one that lasted 2 hours. Holy cow, aren't you glad I didn't make you read that one? Jeez. I mean, I get a note to myself, I would get to look this up to see what this is about. The other speaker, Edward Everett, was well known to the crowd at the dedication that day. A former U.S. congressman and senator, he had plenty of practice speaking before an audience. Everett got more practice at Gettysburg. He spoke for 2 hours, longer than many movies last today. While a speech of that length might sound overwhelming or boring to us, it was common in the 1860s. The crowd applauded, but Everett praised the president for his short speech in a letter written the next day. I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of an occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. In other words, Everett was impressed that the president said so much in such short time. Lincoln wrote back that he was glad to learn that his speech was not a total failure. That's interesting. Even as like a totally accomplished person and very capable, he didn't even feel like he was doing the best job. That's interesting. I'm going to put that there. Because it makes me want to think, should I put that? It's interesting to think that even Lincoln didn't know if he was going to be able to get to the point. This is not a very good drawing, by the way. I'm just going to say that. Days before the event, President Lincoln told a journalist that his speech would be short. True to his word, the president spoke for only 2 minutes. Still, Lincoln gave careful thought to his words on this solemn day. Witnesses describe Lincoln riding on the train to Gettysburg. And even the morning of the ceremony, he continued to write until it was time to go to the cemetery. A lot of the times writing a short piece is way more difficult than writing a long piece, because a short piece you just need to make sure your points are clear and that you address the whole picture. The Battle of Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war. But even 4 months later, few people understood this. Confederate leaders now saw their loss as a defeat rather than a disaster. Some in the North were sick of the war. They wanted to let the South go, and Lincoln couldn't tell them that the victory was just around the corner. He knew it was not. Lincoln had to find a way to keep the Union strong and in the fight. That day at Gettysburg, he needed more than a good speech. He needed a great speech. So he was kind of afraid everything would fall apart. I've been that way before. It's kind of how I feel about online learning. I feel like there's just, obviously not speaking such a sad occasion, but today, the subheading, what did President Lincoln say? Today, the Gettysburg Address is considered one of the most inspiring speeches in American history. Since Lincoln gave his famous speech before tape recorders were invented, however, there is no proof of his exact words. Reporters at the cemetery wrote down what they heard and then sent it by telegraph to newspapers. What's more, 5 copies of the speech exist that were written in Lincoln's own handwriting, all slightly different from each other. Oh, that's interesting, so they don't really know. That's a fact. I like that interesting fact that they have 5 copies, but they don't really know which one he really said. And then who's to say if he got up there and did it in less? How did the president sound? Because the Gettysburg Address was given in 1863, we didn't have recordings of it, but many witnesses and reporters wrote about it. It was said that Lincoln spoke loudly and clearly, but also slowly and carefully. Lincoln's slow speech may have been for effect, to reflect how serious and solemn his words were. It also could have been because he knew his remarks were not very long. We now know that Lincoln was coming down with a serious illness when he gave the Gettysburg Address. Most who saw Lincoln that day describe him as appropriately sad and mournful. Lincoln's secretary also said his color was ghastly and his face was haggard. That's not very nice. It just means like rough looking. The president mentioned weakness and dizziness on the day in the morning before the famous speech. By the time Lincoln boarded the train home, he was feverish and had a severe headache. He was later diagnosed with smallpox. Oh my gosh. Smallpox killed so many people. And he was at that thing. I wonder how many people had it. Smallpox, by the way, it was a huge pandemic. Pandemic. Everybody had it. It killed hundreds and thousands of millions of people. Just if you want to know what bad was, that was really bad. The most popular version of the Gettysburg Address is the 5th and last one. Lincoln even signed and titled this version, which is why it is the most often reproduced copy and is considered to be worth almost $500,000. I bet it would be more worth. That's crazy. It hangs in the Lincoln Room of the White House. Here is the text of the version. 87 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that nation might be free. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot allow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power, and add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And this is his final speech. So now, having my journal out, my history journal, I am going to do my facts. Week 2, day 2. The Gettysburg Address. All right. So the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to take my paper out and I'm going to go back to my first page where I started to highlight. Number 1 fact. Nearly 51,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing after the first 3 days of war. Number 1. Capital of my sentence. Nearly 51,000 soldiers were dead. Wounded or missing after 3 days of war at Gettysburg. That's huge. That's a lot of people dead in one day. They're willing to fight. And it wasn't like the Africans that were slaves, the African Americans that were slaves. It's not like they were the people from the North. There were all different races and even genders that were fighting in the war. Some women lied about being a woman and said they were men so they could fight in the war. So they could do other things than just be a nurse or something that they felt was not where they wanted to be. Next, I wanted to say Lincoln's speech was only 2 minutes long, period. Capital, period, complete sentence. Same thing up here. Gettysburg needs to be capitalized when you use it. +2. Number 3. I'm going to write this down. The main speaker at Gettysburg spoke for 2 hours. I'm writing that really big because that's a lot of talking. And I am going to make sure I put his name in parentheses, Edward Everett.
14-6, the Chargers over the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs.
They kind of said again that was like almost like a movie back then. It was very common for people. So I'm going to capitalize. I have lots of capitals and I have an end mark. So I get 2 more points for that. Number 4. My 4th thing. My 4th thing that I was going to write is Lincoln. C-O-L. Lincoln was sick with smallpox, which was a pandemic. Think about that. One of the greatest, they believe anyway, one of the greatest presidents actually was sick with a pandemic, smallpox, when he gave an address at a war. All right. So I have capital for Lincoln, a period, a capital for Gettysburg. I have a complete sentence. So that's my points in my last sentence. For my A is Lincoln, another fact. Lincoln's speech is valued at $500,000 or $500,000. I feel like that is probably, I feel like if you had it, you could probably get more than that, because that's a pretty big deal to have the only copy. That's pretty cool though. All right. You have your 5 facts. You have your reading done. You're ready for science.